like Linus found out in the Charlie Brown series, he was waiting for the Great Pumpkin. We've got the Great Pumpkin. It's Brad Tavares' yearly turn at fighting. We get a fight between the ranked middleweight Brad Tavares taking on Stillknocks, the former UFC double champ and KSW champ Dricus Du Plessis. And for Brad Tavares, it has been a wild, and I'm talking wild, UFC career that he has had. I can talk about the knockouts. There's only a few. I can talk about the decisions. There's a lot of them, but primarily a guy that's going out there and doing similar things in the majority of his fights. He's a guy that's trained out of Extreme Couture for years and years and years. But when you look at it for Brad Tavares, a 14-6 UFC record, he's tied for second all-time in decision wins behind Neil Magny. Wasn't able to get another decision win last weekend. Shavkat Rakhmonov.
That's one of those stats you hear, though, and it makes perfect sense. You don't hear that, and you're like, wait, Neil Magny has that many decisions? So no, that stat makes perfect sense to me.
But for Brad Tavares, he made his UFC debut in 2010 following an appearance on The Ultimate Fighter 11. He was, 23 years old, like a fresh-faced guy. And he went out there and had some wild fights. I mean, Court McGee won that season of The Ultimate Fighter. He's still kicking it, but he is a few years older. For Brad Tavares, goes out there, has some back-and-forth fights. I mean, I go back to the fight he had against Phil Baroni, and Phil cleans his clock. And then Brad gets back up, and Brad beats Phil Baroni, beats him pretty handily up against the mat, and then down against the cage, and you know how it goes. But for Tavares, primarily a guy, we touched on this before we even started to film, but really, really thunderous leg kicks, and he was one of those guys that brought leg kicks into his game before it was popular, and it was a talking point every single weekend. So for Tavares, he was able to ride home on that fact. He was able to become a ranked fighter with that. I'd say his biggest wins probably over who? Krzysztof Jotko when he finished him?
No.
Talis Leites maybe? What would you say?
Here's the weird thing about Brad Tavares, and this is my whole entire point. When was the last time Brad Tavares won a fight you thought he wasn't supposed to? He beats everybody he's supposed to beat and loses to everybody he's supposed to lose to. And that's the weird part about being Brad Tavares at this point in his career.
Brad Tavares.
We talk about Neil Magny, how he's a gatekeeper. We talk about Derek Brunson, how he's a gatekeeper. Brad Tavares is a gatekeeper too, but he's a gatekeeper who's lower down in the division. So the problem is, a lot of guys do tend to get through this gate. And that's the thing about Brad Tavares. I don't have the mouse in front of me if you don't mind pulling up his record. But if you go back and look at the recent amount of wins and losses that he has, a lot of his wins are over aging guys who he's expected to win. Guys like Antonio Carlos Jr., who is on his way out of the organization. Or Mario Akhmedov, the exact same thing. Krzysztof Jotko, I guess there was some hype behind him, but even then, he wasn't really at the peak of his powers. Talis Leites was very old in his career.
Talis Leites was 36 at that point and took so much damage. He got dropped by a leg kick. His eye on the left side was completely done. And the Elias Theodorou fight was actually kind of close.
So Talis Leites got dropped by a leg kick and got destroyed. And the Elias Theodorou fight, not really. But that's the thing about Brad Tavares. The Kalmai Galej fight was pretty close too, but that's the thing about Brad. None of his fights are that... there's not a big separation between him and his opponents because he's not a natural puncher. Even go back to some of the previous losses. Lost to Yoel, Tim Boach, yikes, and Robert Whittaker. Yoel, Robert Whittaker, there's no shame in that whatsoever. Israel Adesanya too, but you get what I mean when I'm talking about his record. Every single person who you thought has some hype and they're on their way into the rankings, they kind of mopped the floor with Brad Tavares. And even like Edmund Shabazian, a guy who had a lot of hype, before he got into the rankings, then he fought guys in the rankings, and we kind of realized how good he was able to get past Brad Tavares. I don't think Dricus Du Plessis is some world beater by any means. I think he's one of those great fighters who, he has a lot of power, he has an exciting style, and on his best day, I think he'd be like that 13th to 15th ranked guy. I just think he's not the fastest guy in the world with his hands, so we might get into a little bit of trouble against the higher ranked fighters. But against Brad Tavares, I think he has an answer for every single question Brad Tavares brings to this fight, like you talk about. He has a good leg kick. Well, Dricus Du Plessis does have a pretty light lead leg. He's someone who almost will shell up prematurely. It is kind of weird. He'll almost think the punch is coming before it's supposed to, which is a little weird, and that's the only reason why I think the odds are where they are, and that's kind of what I'll end on. I was surprised to see that Dricus Du Plessis was a slight underdog. I understand the odds are almost par, and I do expect them to be par by the time this fight comes around, but I felt like Du Plessis would have a lot more hype coming into this matchup with Tavares.
I did a ton of tape study for these fights coming up this weekend, more than I usually ever do, and when it came to this one, I looked at Brad Tavares, and I had this idea of Tavares in my mind's eye. A lot of leg kicks, a lot of 1-2 boxing combinations. He's got a great right hand, and he's speedy for what you think of, Brad Tavares, or at least he was speedier than I had this image of him.
Did you think he was bad at 5,000 before?
But again, for Brad Tavares, 14-6 in the UFC. How many pay-per-view cards, if you had to hazard a guess, how many pay-per-view cards do you think Brad Tavares has been on in 20 UFC fights?
4.
8! He's been on 8 pay-per-view cards. Like, Brad Tavares, bring home the bacon, baby. Let's put Brad on that card. For Du Plessis, this is the thing. I mean, he kind of got his foray and his entry into MMA from kickboxing. He was a 2012 champ, and I want to make sure I get it right. WAKO 2012 first place in the 86 kg category as a junior. So he gets into that, gets into MMA. He's got an early loss to Gareth McLennan, you know, a guy who was in the UFC at one point. But for Dricus, he was the EFC welterweight champ, the EFC middleweight champ. He goes over to KSW, wins that welterweight strap. He has the crazy fights with Roberto Soldic, a guy who, if he came into the UFC, if you like Dricus Du Plessis, if you like Mateusz Gamrot, whether you thought he won or not, I don't care. Roberto Soldic is that guy. Like, he is a wild, wild fighter.
USADA.
So for Dricus, I don't know about that, allegedly. But when I do look at Dricus, beats Joelton Luderbach after losing to Soldic, beats Brendan Lesser over at the UFC to win back the middleweight strap, comes into the UFC, wild fight against Marcus Perez, beats him, great fight against Trevin Giles where he drops him with like, just Trevin's hands are low. We're going to drop him with a straight punch. And it was kind of a bit of an odd one. But when I look at the strikes for Du Plessis, if you think that he's rigid or maybe he's a little nervous in the Perez fight, 26-14 for significant strikes that favored Du Plessis in that first fight. In the second one against Giles, 25-10. And for Du Plessis, throws great kicks. He can throw body, head. He can mix it up. Good leg kicks. Really good boxing combinations. Really crisp with those. Very accurate striker. But my biggest knock on Stillknocks when it came to his way into the UFC, it's his takedown defense. And that's the thing. When I think of Brad Tavares, I think of, okay, WrestleBoxer, Extreme Tour in my mind's eye. Brad Tavares doesn't shoot that many takedowns, though. That's the thing. Like, Brad Tavares isn't big with it. He has good takedown defense, and he can force the action up against the fence, but he isn't the most active guy going for takedowns. So it would surprise me if he did that against Du Plessis. It really would. And again, for Tavares, he was able to take down Seth Basinski. He's able to take down Dongyi Yang. But, like, I'm going way back into the past. 2 against Lorenz Larkin. But it's not really a trend that's picked up lately. Omari Akhmedov almost won the fight against Tavares after Tavares dropped Omari Akhmedov because Akhmedov was going for the takedowns. The fight against Antonio Carlos Jr. was closer than it needed to be.
He beat the brakes off Antonio Carlos Jr.
But again, you'd think a guy like Brad Tavares in the rankings would mop Shoeface, but he didn't. But when it comes to the odds for this fight, Matt, Tavares open to -130 favorite, -103 right now. Du Plessis open +110, -113 as it stands. We have a look at the Tapology votes. Surprise to us, they are to you. I'm going to say over under 65% for Du Plessis.
Under.
I'm going to say it's under. It's over. So 824 total votes, 82% Du Plessis, 79% by knockout. For the 18% that have Tavares, 71% by decision, and 18% that I have him to win by knockout. So Matt, again, kind of tipped our hand on this one, but what's the pick here?
I'm just really confused by Brad Tavares, the favorite in this fight, if I'm being completely honest with everybody. Again, Brad Tavares tends to lose to the upper echelon tier of prospects in this division, and I don't think Du Plessis is going to go on and just run through the rankings, but I think he's good enough to beat a couple guys in the rankings, and for Tavares, most of his fights come down to, can I not get knocked out? And does my opponent not throw a crazy amount of volume? Because if you are a heavy-handed striker, you will eventually get to Brad Tavares. And the other side of that is, if you're not a heavy-handed striker, but you have a lot of volume, you can also beat Brad Tavares in a fight like that. So, unless he's in a fight where he's against, like, almost like a jiu-jitsu fighter who has okay hands and poor wrestling, those are the types of guys who make Brad Tavares look really good. Pure strikers, for the most part, are able to outwork Brad Tavares on the feet. And like you said, you would look at his camp, look at the amount of experience he's had in the UFC, and think, hey, this guy has some wrestling in his back pocket. But if you don't do it in the cage, I don't think all of a sudden we're going to see it just magically in your, 21st fight in the UFC. So for Brad Tavares, unless he is something that we never thought he was up until this weekend, I do like Dricus Du Plessis in this matchup. And again, I don't love his just sort of awkwardness in the pocket, for lack of a better term, because it is kind of weird to see. And I do think the Chris Curtis fight, which hopefully they do revisit that in the near future.
Yeah, so the Du Plessis point that I just wanted to make, he was booked in the interim since his last fight, because he's been in the UFC for almost 2 years. He's only had 2 fights. He was booked with Andre Muniz, Chris Curtis, Hernandez, and Gastelum, and that Gastelum fight was the last one that fell out.
The Chris Curtis fight would be a really fun one. Hopefully we do get that, especially with Curtis coming off the win over Rodolfo Vieira, and especially against Du Plessis. I think that'd be a great fight. But for Dricus, this is an interesting fight because I think it will go late. but I still have him winning this fight. I just think technically he's a much more sound fighter than the striker that Brad Tavares presents in the majority of his fights.
In 20 UFC fights, Brad Tavares has 4 knockdowns. 3 of those 4 knockdowns are in the third round of fights. The Phil Baroni one was the only one
2
that
of them
he got
came
in the first
11
round.
years apart, though.
And
it went from Phil Baroni to Christophe Jotko. I went from grade 6 to last year.
Talis Latis, actually. 2017 was the next one.
Isn't that wild? Like, 7 years. You're a middleweight. If you're a flyweight, I get it. There's a lot of decisions down there, but in the middleweight division, it is very surprising to see a guy go years without getting a stoppage victory. Maybe he will sit down on his shots against Du Plessis when he is shelled up against the cage, but if Du Plessis is able to respond with his own power shots, I think he'll land.
If I'm going Tavares non-controversially, I'd say Tavares by decision. For me, though, I do like Dricus Du Plessis in this matchup. I think the volume is the key for Du Plessis, and he throws in droves. And yes, through that high guard of Tavares, maybe Du Plessis is able to mix it into the body, but I can't wait for this fight. Both of us going with South Africa's Stillknocks Du Plessis to get the win. Let us know down below in the comment section who you have. We have a big time title fight at the top of this card in this division. Brad Tavares fought Israel Adesanya, wasn't able to get the win. We'll see if Jared Cannonier can do it for that belt. You're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, as we always say. Let's get into it.